Hey church, you've probably heard me say before that our mission here at South Hills is to lead unchurched people into a growing relationship with Christ. That's why I'm super excited to be launching something called Rooted this fall. I have Jeff, our central director, here with me today. Jeff has a lot of experience with this course. Jeff, why don't you tell our church a little bit about what this Rooted program is all about?
Yeah, so what Rooted is essentially a 10-week journey to connect you with God, the church, and your purpose. You're going to be exposed to what we call 7 different practices in Rooted within the small group setting. Because you may be wondering, is this for me? I've been following Jesus a long time. I'm pretty new to the church. I'm not even sure about church. Rooted is for everybody. So if this is your very first day in church and you're wondering, what is my next step? Rooted is for you, because we know that you will never move beyond the fundamentals of practicing our faith. So jump into Rooted.
I just want to make sure you know we truly believe this is a foundational decision for our entire church. So as we dive into this, please don't just look at this as another thing that we offer. It's the thing we offer for you to grow in your relationship with God.
Registrations for Rooted are open right now. You can sign up by opening up your Church Center app, or you can talk to somebody at the Connect bar, or you can go on the campus webpage of the campus that you attend. All of the details on when Rooted is happening at your particular campus and how to sign up are all answered right there. We would love to see you guys sign up. Let us know if you have any questions along the way, and a staff member or volunteer would love to answer those questions.
It's not true.
Now Laura's going to take it personal.
Don't try to we gotta
Save America.
So you might not have thought about it, but if you took a second, and what would you imagine if you were to kind of try to figure it out? What would you imagine? What is the thing that you talk about the most, or at least the thing that you talk about most often? So a couple of years ago, we were hanging out with my brother and his wife, and we were giving my sister-in-law a really hard time for how much time she spends on social media. And of course, she got really defensive. And so we decided to play a little game where everybody took out their phone and we opened screen time, the screen time feature on our phones, just to compare stats. And if you don't know, screen time tells you how much, if you have an iPhone, it tells you how much time that you've spent on your phone, but it also tells you what apps that you've used the most, how much time you've spent on those apps, which days you use them the most, along with all of your averages for the past week, the past few weeks, the months, sort of globally for your whole life that you've owned that phone, compares all of those things. And when you do it, you will be horrified and embarrassed just how much time you spent on your phone, which we all were. We were all completely embarrassed, and there was a lot of denial, a lot of like, what? There's no way. There's no way this is true. There's no way I pick up my phone this often. I have never done that. I just don't look at it that often. If you've never done it, you should give it a try. You will be in denial as well. Now, wouldn't it be interesting if we could get that kind of feature enabled for our mouths, for our conversations, where you could see how often you have certain conversations or how often you use certain words? I mean, think about it, moms. Could you imagine seeing the data on how often you say the same things over and over and over again to your kids? Clean up the room, clean up the room, clean up the frickin' room. Put the toilet seat down. Did you brush your teeth? Let me smell your breath. Don't put that in your mouth. Keep your hands to yourself. Wash your hands. Sit down. Go to sleep. Are you listening? Close the door. Right? It'd be a whole bunch of things like that. Right? It'd probably make your head explode if you saw how often you say some of those things to your kids. But beyond that, wouldn't it be really interesting to see how often that we talk about specific topics or themes? Right? For you to be made aware how much you talk about certain things. I don't know about you, but as curious as I would be about that, to see that report, I'd also be a little bit nervous about what it might say that I spend a lot of time talking about. And I'd certainly want to control who would see that information. And just like screen time, I think a lot of us would probably be in denial. What? There's no way I said that word that many times. Yeah, well, you were pretty upset, so you did say that word a lot. Right? Like, well, I say, I use the word, I'm not even aware of how often I use the word awesome. I say it a lot. I say it in almost every text. I say it's just awesome because that's just my general disposition about life, is it is awesome. Somebody asked me how I was doing this morning. I thought 99.9% of the days of my life are awesome, so I'm doing great. But I don't want to know how often I use that because it would not be awesome to see how many times I say that. There's no way you would see it like there's no way I talked about BTS that much, or essential oils, or tattoos, or tacos, or golfing, or David Hasselhoff. There's no way I talked about that guy that much, right? Like, but I think like politics would be one of the things that we were like, I don't think I talk about it that much. And so we stepped into this conversation a couple weeks ago called the political powder keg. And in the first week, we talked about how Jesus didn't really come to save our country or any country. He came to do something completely different, which was set up his kingdom. And at the top of our list for a lot of us, we care immensely about what happens in our country, but it's not necessarily at the center of why Jesus came at all. And then last week we talked about how this idea about differences when it comes to, especially when it comes to politics, are inevitable, but division, us being separated, divided, at each other's throat, that's a choice. Like we have a choice in the matter. And now, if you're here and you're a guest this morning, or you're not a follower of Jesus, this is kind of a unique series for us, is because most of the topics, most of the conversations that we have, most of the series that we have is really, we're kind of talking to both audience. If you're a non-church person or this is all new to you, we try really, really hard to include a lot of conversation that really speaks to you no matter what you believe. And certainly if you're a follower of Jesus, we're targeting and having that conversation with you as well. But in this particular conversation, it's really just targeted specifically at those of us that are Jesus followers. Like if we got a report on the things that we talk about, that you talk about, I think we'd be surprised how often politics, or at least how often stuff that's political in nature, comes up in our conversation, even for those of us who aren't super into politics. It seems like there's a political detour in virtually every conversation we have. And we're talking about one thing and it's like, oh, did you see the post? And then boom, it's off and running, right? At the very least, it seems like almost every conversation is full of like political signposts as everybody is sort of subtly or not so subtly signaling which side that they're on. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong at all with being interested in and talking about tacos or David Hasselhoff or even politics. It's not wrong to be passionate about elections and policies and outcomes, but we'd have to admit, all of us, that the way that we speak about politics often sparks a reaction in the people around us. Because the truth is, the people in your life, the people in our lives, the people in your orbit, they're all in a conversation with our political commentary. We don't always see or hear about it. We don't always see their interactions. We don't always see their reactions, but they're there. And it's affecting your relationships. It's affecting how people see you and perceive you. And at best, people who disagree with you sort of roll their eyes every time you go off on a political rant. Or at worst, they start kind of avoiding you or scrolling past you or muting you or blocking you. And the circle that you have just keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller until it's only people that you agree with. Now, if you're a church person, that's not super healthy. But if you want to live in a kind of a political echo chamber, who cares, right? It's your life. If you're not a follower of Jesus, live it how you want. But if you are a Christian, if you're somebody that's like, I care about Jesus and what he says, and I'm trying to follow him, like this is where it gets really tricky for us because there's a lot more at stake. Like, think about it. Have you ever avoided something just because you were annoyed by or you didn't like somebody who was into it? Like you knew somebody and they were kind of annoying and they were really into the thing and you were just like, there's no way I can be into that thing because that really annoying person is into okay, so I'm the only one. So this is a confession. I have, like for instance, like for the longest time, I avoided all Apple products because Apple people were just so annoying. They acted like it was their job. They like to market the products to everybody. And it's like, settle down, Apple people. And so I just avoided. I didn't know what I was missing because once I got Apple products, I realized like, oh, now I am one of those people because I talked about it all the time. Or like one of my favorite shows of all time, it's kind of weird, but TV shows was the show Lost. Anybody watch Lost back in the day? Well, I had this friend, his name was John, and John was just a psycho about Lost. And so for years, I didn't even watch it till it went off the air because I was just like, dude, I don't want to watch the show because you make it sound so annoying. I'm just not into it. And the uncomfortable reality is that lots of people don't want to have anything to do with Christianity because of Christians. In their minds, people are thinking, if they're what that's about, I don't want anything to do with that thing. And more often than we'd like to admit, it's usually over something political. And maybe you're in the camp where you had a church experience or you grew up going to church and that was the reason you walked away. It's just because it was so political. You're just like, I just can't handle it. Which, if you are somebody that is a follower of Jesus, then right now we feel that dilemma, right? Like, so, okay, then what are we supposed to do? Like, because we can't just sit by and do nothing. I mean, it's not personal. We're not trying to hurt people. We're not trying to alienate people, but we have to take a stand, right? And honestly, like I get that feeling, and I even agree in some ways. But the problem is that a lot of bad church experiences are connected to someone taking a stand that left them standing over or on top of somebody else. To which we would go, well, okay, well, I don't really want that. But I mean, look around. The country's crumbling. People are saying and doing crazy things that are hostile to our beliefs, to our values. If we don't speak the truth and say what's right, who will? And so there's this very real tension right there. But it's not unique to us. It certainly isn't new. A lot of Christians and a lot of the churches that were forming in the New Testament around the Mediterranean Rim, in the shadow of the Roman Empire, were wrestling with the same types of questions and the same struggles. But I want to begin here in the scriptures. Listen to what the Apostle Paul was somebody that was hostile towards Christianity. Then he had an encounter with Jesus, and then he became its greatest advocate, traveled all over the Mediterranean Rim, starting churches, and then wrote letters back to those churches, and many of those letters comprise what we call the New Testament. And so in 1 Corinthians, in one of the letters that he wrote to a church in Corinth, in chapter 5, verse 12, Paul says this. He says, "It isn't my responsibility to judge outsiders, but it certainly is your responsibility to judge those inside the church who are sinning." Wow, okay. So Paul's going like, look, it isn't any of my business, and it certainly isn't any of your business to judge what people who aren't a part of the church, who don't believe like us, to judge what they're doing and how they're living. But if we don't do it, who will? And Paul would say, well, God will. In fact, God's the only one who should. The weird thing is, did you catch the part where he says that it is our responsibility to judge amongst ourselves, which is a whole lot less fun. Am I right? Right? It kind of puts a hole in the whole like, only God can judge me thing. Because, I mean, Paul just didn't, he said the exact opposite. When you read this, I think sometimes we're tempted to go like, look, I'm fine with that, whatever. Like, I'm not trying to judge or control anybody. Live and let live, man. But they started it. They're trying to change the moral standards. They're trying to force a different way of life on me and on our culture. And I hear stuff like that all the time. And while there's some truth to it, it's basically like, you ever like catch your kids fighting and they're immediately like, well, he started it. Like that's what we sound like. Well, they started it, so that justifies anything that we do or say, right? To which I think Paul would say, look, nobody's telling you not to be involved. In fact, you should be involved. You should take participation in the government and elections. You should take it seriously. There's a stewardship there. There's an accountability because you have that opportunity and that freedom. It all matters. But the revolution that Jesus wants to bring, it isn't going to come through politics or politicians. It's not going to come through legislation. It's going to come through the change of the human heart. See, I think the uncomfortable reality that's easy for us to ignore is that many of the challenges, or a lot of the challenges that we're facing in society, they're not because unbelievers don't behave like believers, but because believers don't behave like believers. I think that's part of what Paul was getting at. Why are you worried about people out there? Right? Like, why are you so worried about people, what they're doing out there, or how they're living, or how they're voting? Look at yourself in the mirror. Look at your heart. Look at your life. Look at your family. Look at how you're living. Okay, yeah, but that's just one guy in one verse. Well, it's really not. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12. This is a guy who was one of Jesus's inner circle, Peter, James, and John. There was the 12, but then there was the 3. That same Peter. He wrote these words in verse 12. He said, "Be careful to live properly among your unbelieving neighbors. Then, even if they accuse you of doing something wrong, they will see your honorable behavior, and they will give honor to God when he judges the world. For the Lord's sake, submit to all human authority, whether the king as head of state or the officials that he has appointed. It is God's will that your honorable lives should silence those ignorant people who make foolish accusations against you. For you are free, yet you are God's slaves. So don't use your freedom as an excuse to do evil. Respect everyone and love the family of believers." He's going, you got to live so honorable, so loving, so respectfully towards people, including those who don't act or believe or vote like you, that even if they don't like you, that your life and your track record and your family and the way that you live, it speaks for itself. And then he says to submit to human authority, the head of state or the king and any government officials that they appoint. Why? Why, Peter? Because they deserve it? Because you agree with them? Because you approve of what they stand for or how they govern or what their policies are? No. He says, for the Lord's sake. Now, if we were honest, and since I have the mic, I'll just be honest for all of us. It's easy for us to skip over verses like this because we don't like them. I know. Honestly, I almost left a couple of these verses out today for that very reason, because it's like, oh, that's a little heavy-handed there, Peter. That's a little uncomfortable there, Peter. Why would you say it that way? Because they offend our 21st century American sensibilities. The problem is that they're in there. So then what we normally do once we read them is we start looking for ways to poke holes in them and dismiss what they mean. One of the joys of being a pastor, I've been a pastor for going on 30 years, it always cracks me up that people who never read the Bible all of a sudden become like biblical scholars when you start reading verses that they don't like, right? Talking about, in the Greek, it doesn't really mean that. If you look up this other verse, it's like, have you read the Bible? They're like, well, no, but I saw this YouTube video and this other guy and the TikTok guy said, no. Look, I know the immediate pushback is like, okay, well then the whole like submitting to the governmental authorities, like, well, where's the line? And I'll be honest, while I have some thoughts about that, I don't have all the answers, but here's what I know. Peter, the guy who wrote that line, he wrote it at a time when he was living under the rule of Nero, one of the most evil, vile, brutal dictators in all of human history, and yet he still said it. And he's like, I said what I said, right? Think about that for a second. We're so used to calling a president or a governmental official that we don't like an evil dictator, but Peter was actually living under one of the worst in human history. Now, I think part of what he was saying is like, look, before we represent ourselves and our interests and our agenda and our political system, we actually represent Jesus and his interests and his agenda in the world. If you're a follower of Jesus, this is what he's driving at. So I really like documentaries. I've reached that age now. I think there's an age where once you hit 45, you're all of a sudden like, I'm interested in documentaries. So I watched one a couple of months ago. It was called The Three Identical Strangers. Anybody seen Three Identical Strangers? It's fantastic. I think it's on Hulu. So it's the story about these triplets that were, it's very sad, yeah. But they were separated at birth and adopted by 3 different families as part of an experiment. It wasn't even one of those things that just sort of weirdly happened or just kind of organically happened. No, there was this agency and this organization that decided, like, what would it be like to take, what's the difference between nature and nurture? So they took triplets, split them up, put them with different families, one kind of a poor family, one middle class, one sort of upper class, and then decided to just sort of track them and see how they did. Yeah, this is in the United States, okay, by the way, in the 80s. It's crazy. But what if we were making a documentary about you? And it told all the ups and downs and all the highlights and low points and all the embarrassing moments. You know those embarrassing moments. A few years ago, gosh, probably maybe it's going on about 10 years ago. We were living in Northern California, and I ran out one night to get some McDonald's. And I was bringing it home for Hansi and I. And I was on the freeway, and I was almost to the exit where our neighborhood was. And I was digging around for the bonus fries because I wanted to eat all the bonus fries and not put them back in the thing. You know what I'm talking about? And so I looked, and while I was digging around, and I kind of like, whoa, kind of swerved a little bit. And then, boom, I got lit up by a CHP because I was swerving. Pulled me over. He got me out of the car, thought I was drunk, and had me do the full field sobriety test. I was like, bro, smell my breath. It's grease. It's not alcohol, man. I'll do a breathalyzer, but it's going to come back as like 2.0 grease. It's not going to come back. But there I am, like friends, church members of our church. They're passing by honking. I'm doing this, just saying the alphabet backwards, the whole deal. So yeah, all of those moments. You might not have one of those, but you've had embarrassing moments. But not just those moments, like the everyday stuff too. And in this documentary, we sent out a team to interview your neighbors and the people you work with and the people who follow you on social media and who've had a handful of dinners with you or hung out with you at your house, and all the other parents who sat on the sidelines for hours during your kids' soccer games or baseball games with you. I wonder what all those people would say about you. Not necessarily the bad or the good, because the reality is most of them probably like you because you're pretty amazing. But I wonder what they would believe, what they would believe is important to you. I mean, how many would know a little bit about your church or your faith or your story? And how would that compare to what they know about your political perspectives, your political opinions, your political frustrations? I wonder what that would be like. We often talk about like, well, look, I'm speaking up because how are people going to know the truth? If I'm not the voice of this, how are they going to know the truth? Well, James, the half-brother of Jesus, he said it so well in James 2:26. He answered this question. He said, faith without Facebook posts is dead. It's just dead. It's me. Oh, I'm sorry. That's not what it said. It said, faith without votes is dead. Sorry. That's not it. No, it's works. He said, faith without works is dead. It's how you live. It's what Peter was talking about. It's the honorable life that you're living. It's how you're living. See, it's so easy for us to substitute believing in Jesus for actually following him. It's easy for us to substitute voting for actually loving people. But faith, genuine faith, it does stuff. In fact, any faith that doesn't do good isn't any good. It's nothing. It's noise. It's just empty words. I've been around church for a long time. And it sounds like I know I'm going hard at Christians this morning and being pretty snarky in the process, but you're my people. And so I'm including myself in this. And as long as I've been around church, Christians, we get really excited when people start talking about like walking the talk and living out loud, and you got to show people that it's real. And we love it right up until the moment where it actually gets specific, right? Where it's like, we're going to live out loud. Okay, love your enemies and submit to the authorities and live sacrificially and live generously. Who's with me? And it's crickets, right? then there's not quite the enthusiasm for really trying to live it out. Why? Because it's hard. It's hard. It's costly. So John, he was one of the others of the inner core of Peter, James, and John. He was one of Jesus' disciples, also one of his closest friends. He saw and experienced Jesus in ways that only a couple of other people did. And after spending 3 years watching Jesus up close, look at what he wrote in one of his letters in 1 John chapter 3. He says, let's not merely say that we love each other. Let us show the truth by our actions. It's our actions that will show that we belong to the truth. So we will be confident when we stand before God. Don't just stand for the truth. Show the truth by your actions, by the way that you live, by the way that you love people. Love doesn't just talk like love, it acts like love. And whatever else love would act like when it comes to politics, I know this, love would never, ever, ever burn a relational bridge over a political belief. It wouldn't. There are going to be plenty of people that say, if you think like that, you believe like that, you vote like that, there's no room for you in my life. But those people should not belong to the family of God. People are more important than politics. That person on the other side is far more precious to God than any of your most deeply held political convictions. And John says, when our love acts like love, that's what shows that we belong to the truth. Now, one of the reasons this is so hard is doing good doesn't always feel good. But you know what usually feels good? Taking a stand. Have you noticed that? It always feels good to take a stand. So guess which one is easier for us to do, right? It's so much easier to make a point, to show somebody that you're right, to flex your righteousness. Man, that feels so good to be like, boom, I got the facts, I got the links. I'm right. And it feels like you've done the right thing, right? You spoke the truth. You dispelled a lie. On top of that, right? Like the icing on it is you also sort of demonstrated why you're superior to them in the first place, which is a nice bonus. But you know what doesn't always feel good? Being loving. It doesn't always feel good. And you know that from your relationships. If you're married, it don't always feel good to be loving. There's times where you're like, oh. If you want to live your life making a point, proving you're right, you can do that. You'll be alone. That's not how love behaves. So John, who spent all his time with Jesus, is like, look, chalk is cheap. Truth is proved right by her actions. Love is what validates the truth. So there's a place in the New Testament where the Apostle Paul, he unpacks what this looks like for him, for his philosophy, and how he relates to the world out there. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning with verse 19. He says, though I am free and I belong to no one. Woo, Paul, were you an American? Come on now. America, freedom. It's like Hulk Hogan playing in the flag. Anybody seen that meme? Okay, never mind. I'm the only one. He says, though I am free, I belong to no one. I've made myself a slave to everyone. Wait a minute. To win as many as possible. He says, to the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not even having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law. Paul, so many parentheticals. By the way, you know what Christ's law is? Love like I have loved you. So as to win those not having the law. Verse 22. To the weak I became weak, to win the weak. I've become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessing. So he's going, I'm free. I can do whatever I want. But this is what I've chosen to do, and this is why. I've made myself a slave to everyone, even progressives, even ultra conservatives? Paul would say, yes. To the Jews, I became like a Jew. To the progressives, I became like a progressive. It's too far, too far. To the conservatives, I became like a conservative. Well, now you're just an idiot, Paul, right? He says, to those under the law, I became like one of them. To those without the law, I became like them. To the weak, I became weak. I became all things to all people. To which we would go like, I don't know, it sounds kind of wishy-washy to me, Paul. What are you, a coward, poser, pretender? Pick a lane. What are you so afraid of? Why are you afraid of what people, what they might think about you? Why don't you just take a stand and say what you really believe, Paul? See, he set aside his freedoms and his rights. Why? To create common ground with people that were nothing like him, that were his enemies, that were opposed to everything his life was about. He was so committed to demonstrating the love of Jesus, like what John talked about, like what Peter talked about, that he did whatever it took to win people to faith, including being misunderstood and mistreated by those who believed like him already, who were just like, you can't say that, you can't do that. Read a little bit of his story. He was mistreated and misunderstood and suffered for everything he did. Why? Why would you put yourself through all of that? Is it because you think they were right? Is it because you think they deserved it? Is it because you approve of what they believe or what they stood for or how they lived? Well, he told us. He said, for the sake of the gospel. He's going, look, because that's what Jesus did for me. You guys don't understand. This is Paul talking, I was trying to destroy Christianity. I made it my mission to imprison and kill as many Christians as I could. And then I met Jesus. And when I met Jesus, it changed everything. And once I met Jesus, then I met his people. And the people that I had been hunting down and trying to imprison and kill, they wrapped their arms around me and they loved me like I was their own. How could I not do for others what Jesus has done for me? In fact, in one of his other letters, he wrote this in Colossians chapter 4. He says, be wise in the way that you act toward outsiders, meaning people who are non-believers. Making the most of every opportunity. See, before we go on, I think the hard part for us, and I think if Paul was here, this is what he would say. He's going, yes, there's an opportunity for you to squeeze in what you think is right politically. But there's something that trumps that. Because if you saying that costs your ability for you to be able to share with them the more important truth, the more important message of the God who loves them, then you got to hold back and restrain your political commentary so that the message that they hear is the message of Jesus. He says, be wise in the way that you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Don't squander any opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so you may know how to answer everyone. He's like, be wise in the way that you act towards people. That don't think and believe and agree and vote like you. Make the most of every opportunity. Okay, but how do we do that? And he answers that question by starting with our words and our conversation, by the things we talk about and the way that we talk about them. Like if you did have that feature like screen time, but for your mouth and for your conversations, what would it reveal about your words and your conversations? I'm not saying don't ever talk about politics. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying we need better political conversations. I'm saying we should elevate the conversation. I'm saying we should be wise in the way that we approach people who don't share our faith. We should redefine the win to the way that Paul defined the win. What if we just got really, really honest with ourselves and just thought, just for a moment, is it possible that your political commentary is creating an unnecessary distraction from people seeing and hearing and experiencing Jesus in your life? Is it possible that all of that is a distraction from what most of us would say is what's truly important? Most of us would say, we wouldn't say that the Republican Party is at the core of our life. If you're a follower of Jesus, you wouldn't say that. And yet we live like that. We wouldn't say that the Democratic Party and their platform is at the core of our life. We would say, if you're a follower, you would say, no, my faith, Jesus is at the core of my life. But then the evidence of how we live is the opposite. And so Paul says, let your conversation always be full of grace and seasoned with salt. What a great description. What a great prescription. I think we often get that recipe reversed, right? Our conversation is usually full of salt and seasoned with a little grace. Have you ever been baking and accidentally swapped out sugar for salt or vice versa? Yeah, the result isn't great. It leaves a bad taste in your mouth. Nobody likes it. See, the best way for us to critique what's happening in our culture, it isn't to complain, it isn't to criticize, it's to actually create a better life and a better way for us to move into the areas where there's problems and messes and begin to love people and serve people and solve those problems. Instead of waiting till we can get the right candidate who says all the right things and we vote for that guy so he can go fix it. Or she. Take your frustrations with the way things are and channel them into serving something or serving someone that's making it better. Create something beautiful and loving that's full of grace and seasoned perfectly with a little salt. To let the way that you serve and you love and the way that you do good do most of the talking and show that we belong to the truth. Now, I know I kind of thrown a lot of scripture at you today, but I want to give you one more. There's a lot of apocalyptic sort of end of the world language that gets thrown around in our culture right now. And a lot of it's coming from Christians, people pointing to various signs and world events, citing different verses from the Bible. And it's often used as a justification for that you should or shouldn't do certain things or act in certain ways, right? I mean, there's that temptation of like, things are getting really bad now. Loving and serving people, like what you're describing, it sounds pretty good and it's okay under normal circumstances, but it's not really, it doesn't work when everything's caving in and the world's about to end, right? And I don't know if the world is about to end or not. I don't want to argue about that. But I do want to read you something by someone who is convinced that it was about to end during his lifetime. See, earlier we read where Peter talked about living an honorable life, respecting everyone, submitting to the authorities. In that same letter, a couple of chapters over, he wrote this in 1 Peter 4. He said, "The end of the world is coming soon." Whew, that's heavy, right? All right. Doomsday preppers, they were right. You got to get like 85 gallons of water. And I'm not making fun. I'm just saying, like, is that what we're supposed to do? Stockpile guns and ammo and food and shelter and be ready to shoot people and the whole deal? The end of the world is coming soon. What would you say, Peter? You think the end of the world's coming. What should we do? Therefore, be earnest and disciplined in your prayers. Most important of all, if the world is ending, this is the most important thing. Continue to show deep love for each other, for love covers a multitude, a mass amount of sins. Cheerfully share your home with those who need a meal or a place to stay. That is not what we're talking about in our culture, right? The end of the world's coming. We should share. That's not what we do. The end of the world's coming. Get out of here. Give me that. We'll wrestle people for TP. Right? and trip people on the way. I know, I did that too. Look, honestly, figuring out what the relationship between my faith and my politics is supposed to look like, this has been like a really long, hard journey for me at times. I know that there's tension around all of this stuff. I've not done it perfectly. I've messed it up a lot. I'm tempted all the time, because of the culture that we live in, to put politics before everything else. And to be honest, there are plenty of times where I don't know how to make sense of all of it. It gets really complicated. But when it gets really complicated, that's when I know that I'm missing it. Because the way of Jesus is simple. It isn't easy. It's hard. But it's simple. Most of the time we're just like, that thing you told me to do, God, it's really hard to love like that. Are you sure? Could you just... Most of the time we don't need more clarity about what we should be doing. We just need the courage to go and do it. So I've decided that if I'm going to err in my life one way or the other, it's going to be trying to live out the way of Jesus. You know what, people out there, you know what, outsiders, you know what, and maybe you're in here this morning because you're just checking things out. But you know what, people who are not a part of the family of God, not people who are believers in Jesus, you know what they expect Christians to act like? You know what they expect us to act like? Like Jesus. You believe it? It's freaking annoying. They expect us to act like the guy that we say is the most important guy that's ever lived and the most important guy that's in our life, and that he's God and he's the Son of God and he died and came back to life and we will follow him forever. They expect us to actually make good on that. It's easier said than done. How are you living? What if all the political commentary, what if you're right? But what if in your rightness, people are missing the love of God in your life? Full of grace, seasoned with salt. Let's pray. God, I want to just start by asking you to look into my heart and the things that I've said today. Lord, if any of it was born out of less than pure motives, God, if any of it was said and came from something less than love, God, that you would take the truth and you would drive it home into our hearts. And Lord, that you would forgive me for any missteps and bad attitudes. But I feel so passionate that we've gotten sucked into the wrong fight. Those of us who are followers of Jesus. It doesn't mean that we're supposed to just exit, not care, not be involved. It just means that we need to redefine the win. And if we're followers of you, if we're believers in Jesus, if we're part of your family, your agenda, your heart, your mission on the earth trumps everything else. And it's hard. It's hard. Lord, would you give us the courage to be loving when we're tempted to take another stand? would we push back and begin to serve instead? We're tempted to be angry, hopeless. May we look around. May we double down on loving each other and sharing with those around us. May our lives, the lives of people of our church, be so full of honor and grace and love that people go, I don't know about all that Jesus stuff, but I know those people, they really love each other. They really are living it out. Lord, would you challenge us where we need to be challenged? Would you bring us along? May we surrender our way and take up your way, even when it's hard. For every person that's here this morning and they don't know you, Lord, I pray that today would be the day that you're just whispering into their soul. You've been in a conversation with them, drawing them, leading them. That's what caused them to come today. They don't know how to explain it because they're not even sure they believe in you. Would you whisper into their soul the words of life? Jesus, that you've come for them. God, we love you. Thank you for your love and grace. Thank you, God, for being with us when we don't get it right, for helping us, God, to get up and to go love each other and love the world around us. In your name we pray. Amen. Amen.
South Hills Church, I just want to take a moment and say thank you for watching our service online. Whether you're watching it for the first time or you're watching it again because you enjoyed the service so much from the weekend, I'd like to take a moment and dive into our giving. Every week we give people the opportunity to give back and give to the local church so that God can continue to bless your lives and bless your finances. Here at South Hills, we believe that everything comes from God. We believe that He's the one that chose us and brought us into this world, gave us our gifts and talents and abilities. And I just want you to know that when we give, we are giving back what God has already given to us. If you've ever seen any of our envelopes at a South Hills campus, you'll see on there that it says, every week at South Hills, your generosity is giving people the opportunity to live a better story. And there's a scripture on there in Matthew chapter 6, verse 21 that says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So I want to encourage you today to click down below and set up your giving, whether it's for the first time or whether you're doing reoccurring giving. We have 4 ways to give here at South Hills. 1, you can do it in person at any of our campuses through an envelope. Or 2, you can actually text any amount that you would like to 84321. And the 3rd way is to download our Church Center app. I encourage you to do this one because the Church Center app gives you opportunity to stay connected with our church and your campuses. It's a great tool and resource for you to know what's going on. And the 4th way to give is to give online. You can go to southhills.org/give and you can set up your giving there. Whether you're a guest of our church or whether you are a member of our church, or whether you simply just like to watch our services, I encourage you to trust God with your finances so that He can bless and anoint your finances and you can be trusting God in this journey of living life to the fullest. I love you and thank you for watching our online service today.